It was the 15th and final conference of MLR. And it was historic. And because it's historic, I decided that I wanted to explain to you that we have reached another historic juncture in the Messianic movement. And it happened at that conference. And among the things that happened is somehow COVID spread around the room, and we got an email. We got home, by the way, COVID, a lot of people came home with COVID, including me, and a lot of people in the world, a lot of the leaders. And there's a lot of things that happened that set things up. The Jerusalem Legal Council was there. We ran into each other in the hallway, and they recognized my name. I know their organization. They are a legal group of lawyers who defend Israel in international court. And they said, "We hear you understand the movement. Can you explain it to us?" So I walked them down the path, and they said, "We need you to meet with our whole team. We need to be aware of this." So I met a little later that evening. I met with our whole team, and I explained to them where did we come from. A lot of people don't know that. They've been working with us for years, and we're like here, but where did we come from? And so I thought that was fascinating. And I have their contact information. They have us. We're staying in contact with one another. And a lot of people really don't understand what is Messianic Judaism and how did we get where we are. And more importantly, we've hit another historic junction. Now, to understand how we came into being in the book of Acts, in the first half of the book of Acts, you're dealing with the movement, which was that point in time historically called the way. You're being replaced anyway. I ordered something that's automatic because you are not. And we were called the way, and just without going all the way back to the Garden of Eden, for those of you that have been here, when I did my series, How Do We Get From the Bible to Here, I started in the Garden of Eden. I want to jump right into the way, which really began with a pioneer, because the whole idea of this is pioneering, okay? And I happen to have been a pioneer, all right? And so Paul, Shaul, Roman name Paul, was the first real pioneer because he took the movement that God was doing up in Antioch after Barabbas, the son of the father, the apostle, went up from Jerusalem, said, "This is significant, we need a teacher. Let's bring in Paul." And Paul knitted together that first congregation where we have the concept of one new man. Couldn't happen before then because everything was in Israel and focused in Jerusalem. There just weren't that many Gentiles. But when you go into a Greek port city like Antioch, all of a sudden you have these Greek-speaking Jews, which is where it started, Hellenist Jews, which means they were followers of the Greek culture. They came in, they had other Greek speakers coming in, and you have one new man, and that was a pioneering effort. And in the second half of the book of Acts is Paul working with the Messianic Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, trying to figure out the rules for this new movement, which was still called the Way, except it was different because the Way was a section of the Jewish people that existed, but you couldn't really, it wasn't really the Way because you had non-Jewish people coming in to a congregational or kingdom center gathering, and it's like, what are we supposed to do? Did they live by the Torah or do they not live by the Torah? And it was quite historic because it was a big question. What do you do with a non-Jew who becomes believer? Are they obligated to keep the Torah or not? Are they obligated to be circumcised or not? Those are normal questions. And it was a huge pioneering effort to take the transition of the way, which it would have been a part of Israel, the initial followers of Messiah, his inner core of 12, his inner core of 3. Now it went out, and it became an historical movement of one new man. Now, the way became one new man, but they didn't give it another name because it was still based in Jerusalem. And so in the Bible, it's still called the Way, those of the Way. The Way is following Yeshua as Messiah. And so you have to have a pioneer to do that, because a pioneer has to deal with really difficult questions. And they may not seem difficult, but they were very difficult. What do you do with a Gentile that's saved? Because the Bible doesn't give a lot of clear indication other than Paul's writings. What do you do with the Gentile that gets saved? A lot of you know the history of this congregation. When I planted it in 1987, I was 25 years old. If a Gentile came in and received salvation, I sent him to the church around the corner because I had no idea what to do with the Gentile that received salvation. I wasn't a scholar in the Bible, and I wasn't a scholar in the history, and I didn't know what to do with Gentiles because I just didn't know Gentiles or what they were good for. And then what had happened was the Way spread throughout the Roman Empire. And most of you are very familiar with this. It started in Antioch, went from Antioch to up and around. It would be, the next thing would be Corinth and then Ephesus. You have these major cities overseen largely by Paul, who's pioneering this one new man effort. It ends up where he ends up in jail until it spills over into the congregation of Rome, which was planted at the 2nd chapter of Acts. And they're dealing with this weird issue there of what do you do with Jews who are saved in Rome. It started in the Roman congregation because Caesar had thrown all the Jews out of Rome. And you see Paul ran into some of them out in the outer regions of the empire. During his journeys, he met Jewish believers who had been thrown out of Rome because all the Jews had to leave Rome, which means you end up a congregation that was Gentile. Except they didn't understand they couldn't be one new man because they weren't, because they were only Gentiles. So they must be Israel because God took out all the Jews and left us. Therefore, we are the new Israel, and he's done with the old Israel. And Paul wrote the letter to Romans before he ever visited Rome. No apostle had ever gone to Rome. And Paul wrote them a letter saying, look, has God cast away his people? God forbid, I'm one of them. And he's trying to straighten out this theology. Now, it's a normal problem. What's the problem? If you have a Gentile congregation and a Jew comes in, what are you supposed to do? What do you do with a Jew that gets saved? Because God chose us and left us intact, and now he's bringing in Jews, but he only works with Israel. And we didn't understand in Rome the one new man either. We just figured we must be Israel because we weren't really the Way, because we were just a part of faithful Israel, all right? And all that stuff happened. Well, then Constantine, a general, he was a general. There were two generals vying for control of Rome. Caesar died. Somebody needed to seize control, and there were two generals. The stronger general was from Ephesus. Ephesus is, of course, an occult center. And he was concerned going up against a general who was practiced in the occult, because Ephesus is known as the occult capital of the world. Now, I'm going to go to battle against somebody who's steeped in the occult. I have a problem. I need help. I need spiritual help. He knew nothing about anything, so he turned to one of his favorite god, Mithras, the Persian sun god. And he called out and asked for assistance against this occult general that he could win. And he had a vision of Mithras, who most of you have seen. If you doubt it, just Google a picture of Mithras. You have a lady with the sun behind her head holding a baby. And said, and he had a vision of her. She had the sun behind her, which is where halos come from. All right? Holding a baby. The baby has to be Jesus, which is the Greek name for Yeshua. Okay? So she was Mary, the Holy Mother of God, and her son was Jesus, who was the anointed one, Mashiach Christos, Jesus Christos. Right? And therefore Christianity was right, which is what they called people who were out in the way, were called in Greek Christianoi, Greek, Christianoi, for little messiahs. All right? This is the way it is, and we're going to take, and he started looking at the congregations and the kingdom centers that existed throughout the empire, and they were spirit-led new man congregations where the gifts and the flowing of the Spirit just went around like 2 Corinthians. One person had a song, one person had a word, one person spoke in tongues, another person interpreted the tongues. If you don't have somebody interpreting, quit speaking in tongues. Do all these things, trying to put some kind of, Roman going into that kind of a mess where everything is being disrupted and stuff. They don't like messes. They need to order it. Let's order Christianity. Because after all, it's about the Holy Mother of God and her little baby, Jesus the Christos. So let's organize this. And he took the Persian religion of Mithras and turned it into Christianity with the high holy day of Ishtar, which is the high point of the spring that everybody knew about. Okay, everybody knew about that particular holiday. They weren't trying to be pagan. They had a confused emperor that was trying to be a Christian, is what that was. And then they said, we need something else. Well, the shortest night of the year is the winter solstice. And so the Messiah was born when you have the shortest night of the year where more light is going to come in. And that's where we'll celebrate his birth, the winter solstice, which became Christmas. You have these two main holidays, and they put it on us. By that point in time, when you're dealing with the things of the book of Acts or the apostolic letters and epistles, the movement has spread all through the Roman Empire, but all of a sudden the Roman Empire, Christianity became the religion of the empire, which was not terribly related to the way. Wasn't terribly related to the way. It was a Persian religion that was made to fit the Bible with a focus on Holy Mary, the Mother of God, and her son, Jesus the Christus, okay? And they organized it, and most of you are familiar with all that. When they did that, a lot of the way fled north. They went into Ireland. Ireland was just beyond the realm of the Roman Empire. They kind of exercised a loose authority up there. The Apostle Patrick, the Messianic pastor up there, led that particular movement. And rather than Rome, they couldn't really apply a religion on them. The Christian movement following Constantine took them to court in Rome, saying that the government had established this is what Christianity is, and they say they are Christians because it's Christiana. They were followers of Messiah. It wasn't a horrible thing right back then. You just have to understand, it's a foreign word. We've anglicized it. And they keep, and the charge was they keep the Passover and they keep the Sabbath. They do not celebrate Christmas and Easter. Therefore, they're not true Christians. And in the Roman court, they said, that's right. You can't say you're a Christian. If you're going to be a Christian, you must follow Christianity. And here's what Christianity is in the law. It was a legal thing. Okay, it was a legal thing. It's in the law. And it's like, well, there weren't many of us left at that point in time. So we fled up north into Scotland, went off the coast and went over to Iona, which is a little island off there. And we kind of planted there. From there, we got concerned that we were still too close to Rome. And so we swung up into what is today the French Alps. But all of a sudden, the way became a history of individuals or small groups in Scotland or in Iona, which is really a part of Scotland today. At that point in history, it was an island. And then up into the French Alps, because the Romans would never march into the French Alps to make us keep Christmas and Easter. We go up there and do Passover and circumcision and keep Shabbat. But we became not a movement. And not much happens after that. It's a spattering of Jewish believers who are not a part of the political system of Christianity. They are still biblically Christians because they follow the Messiah, which is what Christians are supposed to be doing. However, we did not adapt any Persian religion aspects. We simply did what the Bible did, and we kept Passover, we kept Shabbat. Well, the church went on historically, the political Christian church went on and spread throughout almost all of the world, and then they started dividing over petty differences, and they are very petty differences, and you could read all the church history, and it's messy because they're fighting with one another. And a lot of you know, because I've taught this all historically and stuff, it's like the local Mennonite congregation that split over whether you have one suspender up to pray or two suspenders up to pray. You can't pray with one suspender up. You must have two. And there was a Mennonite church in this area that split into two based on whether you could pray with one suspender up or two suspender ups. And I was a part of that particular thing because they brought me in as a peacemaker. And it's like, what do I think? Do you need two suspenders or one suspender? It's like, I don't think you need any suspenders, so I wasn't helpful. And so as a movement, the way ceased to exist. Christianity was there, but it was a political religion. I'm not talking about Christianity of the Bible. I'm talking about Christianity of the political system of Rome, which is what was passed down to all Christianity today as a rule, although a lot of them get in trouble because they read the Bible. If you read the Bible, it upsets all of our things, which is why I threw all the liturgy today. You know what? I don't need the liturgy to worship God. I'm not opposed to liturgy. God's not opposed to liturgy. I'm not opposed to a Christmas tree. God is not opposed to a Christmas tree. If you have opposition to Christmas trees because you were raised Christian with a Christmas tree, and now that you're away from that, you say, ooh, pagan, pagan, pagan. I say, you know what? A lot of what we do is our baggage, and baggage is baggage, which is my next message. I'm giving two messages today. But see, we lost any pioneers. You had first Paul and then Patrick. And if you're not historically educated, Patrick of Ireland was not set out by the Catholic Church. He was not a missionary of the Catholic Church, which means universal, by the way. He was not a part of Christianity. He was a Jewish believer who was an apostle who planted a kingdom center and changed all of Ireland to God. He was a pioneer because he was in a place, God sent him to a place that was absolutely controlled by a cult. A cult, all right? And you've seen them on TV. They paint themselves blue, and they were barbaric people. He went and he just radically got a lot of people saved. Well, they destroyed him in court. They destroyed him in court. And when you go over to Iona, there's no indication that Patrick went there, which means they lost any apostolic oversight. They knew enough to stay away from historical Christianity, not biblical Christianity, historical Christianity. It's two separate things. And they fled into the Swiss Alps. And nothing much happened. And so you come to a point where the Jews are dispersed from Rome, dispersed from Jerusalem. The temple is destroyed. The Jewish people scattered all over the world, and the way has largely ceased to exist. And it's a history of individual people who float around. Christianity is now an historical entity as a political system, but they're not really impacting the world for good, except for those odd people among them who pay enough attention to the Bible that they could go out and teach people about the God of Israel and the Messiah of Israel, and God uses them even though they may have a lot of baggage. Okay? So they've spread the concept of the Creator God of Israel with the Messiah all over the world, although they did it with a weird set of uniforms and baggage, but God used them nonetheless and continues to use them nonetheless. So what happened was, in the fullness of time, which means in the Bible, the fullness of time is the next thing was supposed to happen is God was going to start a redemption of Israel. He had promised to redeem Israel, and he had promised to regather Israel. So in the late 1800s of the Common Era, you have three key people who God said, I have a calling on your life, and we're going to start redeeming Israel. And he started at the same time frame with Theodor Herzl, who planted the Zionist movement. We need to reestablish our homeland in the promised land. That all was birthed from Herzl, Theodor in English, Theodor Herzl. And you had people like Rachmiel Friedland. Rachmiel Friedland was a Talmudic scholar who came into the faith as one of the entrepreneurs that pioneered the Hebrew Christian movement. Okay? Then you had Ben Yehuda, who took a dead language of Hebrew and made it a living language. All this is happening at once because it makes sense. Why would God restore Jerusalem and not restore the people? So he's bringing a restoration of the people. And I wasn't there, but I understand their problem. Here's the problem. We're believers, and we are Jewish, because we tended to be Orthodox. Like I said, Rachmiel, who was another good friend of mine, was a Talmudic scholar. He memorized the Talmud. And so what does he do? Because he's a believer now. And so what he does is, on Shabbat, he's a Jew, but we need to worship as believers. Believers, historically now, for 18 centuries, have been meeting on Yom Rishon. Constantine, to solidify the hold of Mithros, renamed Yom Rishon, the first day of the week, Sunday, because we worship the sun. All right? So we will meet on Yom Rishon, the first day of the week. We will meet on Friday evening because we are Jewish. We will meet on Saturday morning because we are Christians. Not historical Christians, biblically Christians, okay? Rachmiel was one of the first ones that grasped that. There was quite a few others. I'm kind of moved to it. But you need pioneers. Herzl is a pioneer. Ben Yehuda is a pioneer. Friedland these are all pioneers that came in and they did something. And the Hebrew Christian movement was huge. It was huge. It ended up being based in Germany, the largest congregation until Ukraine in the past 10 years. It was the largest Jewish believing congregation of the world. It was the Hebrew Christian Church of Berlin. They have a 500-man men's choir that toured all over Europe. They were famous. They were a huge movement. 3 out of every 4 Jews in Germany were Hebrew Christians. They were Hebrew Christians because we were Jewish, but we were Christian. And how do you put those two together? And it's like, I don't know, but we meet on Friday because we're Jewish. We meet on Sunday because we're believers. And all that happened. Well, then the Holocaust came and wiped out not only a third of the Jewish people, it killed more than 2/3 of the Hebrew Christian movement. It just killed everybody. At the men's choir, there was one survivor, which we flew over and interviewed, so we wouldn't lose that history. Well, then everything was kind of languishing. The Jewish community had been decimated. There wasn't a Jewish person in the world that didn't lose somebody in the Holocaust. And we all knew no matter where we were in the world, it was just a matter of time before they came after us here. It was a deep, dark side time for the Jewish people because the promised land prior to the Holocaust was Poland, where we had complete freedom of religion, and we flocked to Poland. We call it the New Israel. Complete freedom of religion, which is why there were so many Jews in Poland, which is why the Holocaust was big in Poland. But they were destroying the Hebrew Christian movement. Well, then we had the Great War, the war to end all wars. We had the Second World War, which crushed all that. And when the smoke had cleared of the war, you had the Hebrew Christian movement, which is now based in England, because they weren't that strong prior to the Holocaust. Germany was a stronghold, but now everybody in Germany was dead. But you still had the Hebrew Christian in England, and because of the transition out of Europe, they brought it to the United States, and there started to be Hebrew Christian congregations in the United States. Marty Chernoff, Hans van der Steur. No, not van der Steur, it's the wrong name again. I'm thinking about Peter. Hans, I forget Hans' last name. That's terrible. I don't have any notes. And if Dr. Louis Goldberg, you had I see people's face. I can try to remember their names now. Most of them are dead because they were Hebrew Christians. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, dispensationalist Christian, seminary trained. Moish Rosen, Jews for Jesus. He, again, seminary trained Hebrew Christian. And then, but it was just an ineffectual type kind of things, but something was stirring. Something was stirring. Well, then God did something phenomenal in the liberation of Jerusalem. And overnight, the whole Jewish world stopped from living in the shadow of the Holocaust to celebrating the God of Israel, which led to what they called in this country the Jesus movement. The Jesus movement swept both coasts, and nobody knows what happened to those young people that became a part of the Jesus movement. The reality is that's where all of the baby boomer rabbis came from. It was almost all Jewish. That's why it wasn't real strong in the middle of the country. It was strong in the big Jewish sections. And Jewish people were flocking into the kingdom. And before we couldn't wear any Jewish symbolism, when Israel took the badge of shame and made it into the Star of David, we all started wearing Stars of Davids. Because we said, don't think Jew, think Israeli. You know, we're not Jews destroyed by the Germans. We are Israelis that can beat anybody. And it was a total change, but we got swept into the kingdom of God. We got swept into the kingdom of God. There weren't any Hebrew Christian congregations. There were churches led by Hebrew Christians scattered around, but nothing Messianic, because Messianic did not exist anymore. Well, we connected with each other long distance. The first Jewish believer I ever met other than myself, and I don't include my wife, who came 3 months after I came, was Simcha Davidov. Simcha was a Sabra from Kibbutz Kfar Manachim. He lived way down there in West Virginia in the hills, and we were doing ministry all over the place. We were on fire. It was a revival. And we were just going out witnessing on the streets. We had coffee houses. We had Jesus festivals. I did all this stuff. I had 2 coffee houses. I had Jesus festival. We did a drug thing with David Wilkerson, helping our peers get out of drugs and stuff like that. We did all that stuff, and we were doing something. Then we'd get together, and the problem is we were Jewish believers. What were we supposed to do? Because it's not like we can go to a church. And that was the grace of God. I want you to know that. That was the grace of God. Because I got saved in a church. I got saved in a church, a charismatic Bible church. So God just grabbed me, pulled me in there, and I'm sure the guy said, "Do you want to receive salvation?" I said, "Of course I do." He said, "Kneel down, raise your hand, say this prayer." I probably said a sinner's prayer. I'm sitting in a church like, what are these people doing? What are they doing? But God was just pushing me. And I said, okay, I probably said a sinner's prayer. And I said, well, now you're a believer. And you're Jewish, so you know the Old Testament. I said, okay. And he says, you can start teaching Sunday. It's like, okay. And it's like, okay. And so that Sunday morning, I was in junior church teaching the kids because I knew the Old Testament. But the pastor, Richard Mell, was a godly man. He knew the Bible. But God just birthed in me something. I read the Bible. A lot of you know my story. I was sitting somewhere in the middle of the night. I found an American Standard Bible. And I sat there, and it was supernatural. I wasn't used to supernatural. God was speaking to me. I wasn't used to God speaking to me. But I sat there and read the Bible 5 times in one night, from Genesis to the Revelation. Because I had to spend the night there anyway, because I was doing something that I did at that point in time, which was a supervisory position. Didn't have to work, but I had to sit there waiting for appointments to come in during the night because it's the kind of job I had. And I just read it, and it's like, oh, okay, I see it. It's one Bible. I did not know the Old Testament. I didn't know anything. But when I read, I started and I went to Revelation. It's a Jewish book. It makes sense. It's about redemption, and it's like, oh, this makes complete sense. And then 3 months into this, we're trying to connect. We're connecting with other Jewish believers. I said, Simcha was the first. Jeremiah Greenberg. Some of you know Jeremiah. He's up in Tampa now, part of Steve's congregation. I went to a coffee house at West Virginia University to address the student body. And he came and said, well, I'm a Jewish believer. What am I supposed to do? You know? And I said, be a Jewish believer. He wrote the purple Siddur. If you ever see that, that's Jeremiah's. And he says, I can be Jewish and believe. I said, of course, you are Jewish and you believe. What are you supposed to do? I said, I don't know. And I went to my pastor. He'd teach a message, and I go, excuse me. After the service, you applied that message to your church. It's not about your church. It's about Israel. And he says, you have a calling on your life, and God will reveal it to you. I'm teaching types and foreshadows. You are the root, and God will reveal that to you. And it's like, what are we supposed to do? Well, then things got, the Jesus movement, he was flexible guy. All kind of young people came into his church because he could get along with us. You know, a lot of my generations were drug addicts, long hair, a little bit disheveled, people that went to places like Woodstock, you know, yeah. And then it was, the church was growing. He's not going to make you an outer. It's like, okay. And then I heard the anti-Semitism, which I grew up with. Some used to say, now I'm going to have a Jew in charge. And I thought, you know what? I went to Richard, which I called him Richard. I said, Richard, I love you. You have not done nothing but love me, accept me, and help me. I don't want you to experience what I have experienced. I'm leaving. And he said, no, you don't have to. I said, yes, I do. I don't. You don't deserve to hear the garbage that I've grown up with. And so then, and it was about an hour and a half from my house. It's where I got saved. So there's a church right down the street. Went down to church. When I'm knocking, hey, I'm here. I got this nose. My name is Judah. You're Jewish. I said, yeah, we don't allow Jews in our church. I said, oh, that's okay. I never did figure out the rules. And so drove down the other way. And I went to the next church. And I said, hi. And it's like, you're Jewish. I said, yeah, we don't allow Jews in our church. I said, okay. I wasn't offended. was invented. So I decided to go down to the city. We lived a little bit out on the hills. Went down city. Cities, there's a lot more churches to choose from. People are probably a lot more tolerant. I went down and walked up to this church, went in the front door. It's like, hi. He said, oh, you're Jewish. Yeah, I said, we don't allow Jews in our church. I said, I'll never figure out the rules. And so we were starting to gather small groups of Jewish believers and non-Jewish believers because we were all young and we were all fiery. And all of a sudden, it's like, we can't go to church. We don't fit in the church. And it was inevitable that at some point, I learned from my rabbi, I shouldn't mention his name. I don't know if he still remembers. My rabbi. And he stood in the back of the room and talked to people, answered questions. He loved questions. Well, that's where I learned that from. I love questions. I love to ask questions. I love to ask questions. And we'd sit and I'd debate whether Yeshua was the Messiah or not. I was on fire. My Maranatha belt buckle, which is Aramaic for he's our Lord is coming. Maranatha. And it's like, and then one evening, because it was a Friday evening service, the rabbis came over and said, Judah, it would be better if you never came back in. I don't want to see you anymore. I said, yes, ma'am. So I walked out. Rebbitzins are powerful. And I left. And it's like, now what are we supposed to do? And I'm talking to my other Jewish friends. We don't fit anywhere. Now, I was the grace of God. Had the church accepted us, we had gone into the church and assimilated. And we would become historic Christians, not biblical Christians. And it was very easy for us. We would have done that. And God, in His grace and mercy, says, no, I'm doing a redemption. I won't allow you to go into the church. You have to. And so we pioneered, and we got together, and we started meeting. And there were two groups that were meeting, Jews for Jesus, which is in reality Hineni Ministries, but everybody knows them as Jews for Jesus. They are not Jews for Jesus. They are Hineni Ministries. They were running little conferences over New York City. I drove over across West Virginia, picked up Simcha, and we went over to New York and went to a Jews for Jesus in-gathering, they called them. And we sat in the room. There was like 24 of us. And all of a sudden, we're sitting in a room, and for the first time, we had this feeling, if they come in, they're not coming after me. They're coming after us. I'm no longer a minority in this group. I'm one of us, and this was identity. And as the conference went on, there were Hebrew Christians there. Rachmael was there. Rachmael Friedland. There were a couple Hebrew Christians there who were helping us deal with some of these issues because they were scholarly. And somebody said, you like this? You ought to go to Messiah Conference. It's like, Messiah Conference? What's a Messiah Conference? It's over in Pennsylvania. And so we checked out to it. It was a conference. It was at Messiah College. No relationship. I forget what denomination it is. And it was a gathering. And now you go and there's 100 people there. 100 Jewish believers. It's like, whoa. And we're starting to talk. What are we going to do? And we became the pioneers of the Messianic movement. Because the Hebrew Christians were there. Rachmael would be there. Marty would be there. Hans would be there. I'm missing somebody. I don't know, but John Fisher, I forget who it was. Somebody else, and we'd sit around, and he said, well, we meet Friday because we're Jewish and Sunday because, I said, well, we're not Christians, and we don't want to be Christians. I'm one of those radicals. I don't know Christianity. I don't understand it. They don't want us. I don't want them. And there were those of us. I wasn't alone in this. Said, no, we're not Christians. No, you're Hebrew Christians. No, we don't want to be Hebrew Christians. We don't want to be Hebrew Christians. But in 67, it's like, bang, you know what? We're Jews. And so we created our own organization under the auspices of the Hebrew Christian Alliance of America, which was a subsidiary of the British Hebrew Christian Alliance. We started the YMJA, which some of you have heard of, the Young Messianic Jewish Alliance, spearheaded by Manny Brotman. Manny Brotman was one of the pioneers of this movement. We said, we are not Hebrew Christians. We are Messianic Jews. And we wrote the Constitution and bylaws to present to the Hebrew Christian Alliance of America that we were going to start a new organization called the Young Messianic Jewish Alliance. And it says, if you read their constitutional bylaws, we can do anything we want regardless of what the Hebrew Christian Alliance thinks. Well, there was a lot of pushback from the Hebrew Christian movement who controlled everything. But what happened is we had turned 30 years old, which was old. And in our Constitution, we said, when you turn 30, you got to leave because we don't trust old people. And all of a sudden, we show up and we said, I make a motion, we create the Hebrew Christian Alliance. I second the motion. No, you can't do that. Call for the question. I became a parliamentarian. I helped railroad this through. Call for the questions. All of a sudden, there's so many 30 years olds in the room. We changed the Hebrew Christian Alliance to the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America. Moishe Rosen, who has since come back, he's dead now, but he did come back to Messiah Conference and say, look, we have a difference of opinion, and we're not. And he did it in Nikita Cruise. He took off his shoe, and he's pounding on the table on the stage. This is not from God. This is not from God. This is not from God. It will go nowhere. And Marty said, if it's not of God, it won't go anywhere. It is of God, you might be fighting against God. A lot of biblical things happening there. And so now we established the Messianic Jewish movement. We are pioneering the Messianic Jewish movement. What do? We're not Christians. We never want to be Christians. Christians are, and we had to push back against the church. So what happened is people like Dr. Michael Brown, who had been delivered from drugs, wrote a very necessary book, Our Hands Are Stained with Blood, about the atrocities of the Christian church, who was always trying to kill us. And it was us and them, and we were us and they were them. And one of his earliest books was absolutely important. Why? Because we had to push back against the church, who had been anti-Semitic historically, and we wanted nothing to do with the church. And they didn't want anything to do with us, so it wasn't that hard for them to swallow. And the reality is, we're there for the Jewish community, even though they reject us because they rejected the Messiah, they rejected the early way, and we're still there for them. And so we'll try to reach the Jewish community. Christianity, that's God's problem. And then we started planting congregations. The original congregations were not led by rabbis. We didn't want rabbis. We weren't rabbinic Jews. We were Messianic Jews. So the early leaders of the movement, everyone went by their first name. It was Marty, it was Arnold, it was Rachmael. And then we start to gather, and all of a sudden there's more and more congregations coming up. And they were congregations because we didn't want to be synagogues. And so what do we do? How do we define ourselves? We're anti-Christian. We didn't say that, but we were. It was a pushback because they were pushing us. We push back on them, and we give that left hand to the rabbinic community. They're lost. We're the remnant. We're the remnant. We became the remnant. And then we started planting our congregations. And originally they were all congregations. The International Alliance of Messianic Congregations and Synagogue was originally going to be the International Alliance of Messianic Congregations. By the time we got it worked out, I wrote the constitution and bylaws for that particular entity too. There were always the congregations because they came out of the Hebrew Christian movement. They were congregations. Now there were young people coming in. We're calling our place of worship a synagogue because we're a synagogue, we're the faithful. So we made it, if you notice, the UMJC, which split off first, became the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. By the time we formed, which was a couple years later, with the International Alliance of Messianic Congregations and Synagogues, because everyone's like, what do you do? What do you do? And so we're just putting our feet down. We're putting a line. This is the line. We will not cross it. We are Messianic Jews. We are not Christians. We are not rabbinic. We are Jews. But are you supposed to meet on Shabbat? Are you supposed to have a Torah scroll? Are you supposed to be called rabbi? All that stuff was really confused because what do you do with a Jewish person that believes, who doesn't want to be a Christian, who isn't really a rabbinic Jew? Well, it's okay, we're Messianic Jews. It's nice to, and we pioneered. And then God called us to go and plant a congregation somewhere where there's Jewish people. Go in. You have this awkward relationship with the church, which is as it's historical church at its roots, anti-biblical, but they all have the same problem. They have the Bible. And so they read their Bible and they don't know what to do with us either. Nobody really knows what to do with us. We don't fit anywhere. And so what happens is some of the church says, we're happy to have you. Other churches is like, we're the only way, and you got to go with that. And this odd thing, the Jewish community was pushing back against us, trying to destroy us, took turns trying to destroy us, actually, for those of you here during the Dirty Tricks campaign. But we established we were there, and we were adamant. We are not Christians. Their hands are stained with blood. We are not rabbinics. We're the faithful remnant. And that is where pioneers come from. I'm one of the pioneers that was engaged in that particular transition between Messianic Judaism and Hebrew Christianity. Now, to understand why that has to change, I want to give you something that I was made aware of at MLR, which helps people understand. How does a pioneer cease to be a pioneer? Because here's the reality. I'm not trying to establish Messianic Judaism. Messianic Judaism is established. We're not an unknown entity. And it's kind of like Xerox. So I want to give you a history of Xerox. Xerox was a pioneer in the copying industry. They were absolutely pioneers in the concept. And they made Xerox machines. They were so popular that if you wanted a facsimile copy, it was called, "Can you give me a Xerox?" Name recognition. They were huge. They were huge, and they had a lot of money, and they got a research and development group together to develop more stuff. And the stuff, they were just thinking outside the box. They created the first tabletop computer. It weighed 600 pounds. But they created it. Another one of the big things you have heard of, they actually created the computer mouse. Because before the mouse, if you wanted to communicate with your computer, you had to enter commands through the keyboard. All right? 1964, Douglas Engelbart, who was one of their engineers, took a circuit model and a couple wheels and made it interact with the computer with just a click. It was huge. They created the mouse. They really didn't want to get computers because it was expensive. And they were such a successful copy company that they were huge and big and renowned. Then they created the speedometer. All right? Humans can perceive acceleration, deceleration, but we can't perceive actual speed. We don't know how fast we're really going. But before the automobile, we didn't have to worry about how fast we were going. But as the automobiles got faster, it became necessary to understand how fast we were going. They created the speedometer. But it didn't do anything for the copy industry, so they didn't do anything with it. Okay, because they were incredibly successful. They were pioneers. They created text-to-speech synthesis. In other words, this releases a potential for the computer. This releases the potential for the user instead of for the computer. And what this is, it allows people with reading disabilities to interface and I'm trying to think of the word. Just naturally by speaking into the computer. And it's like think of where that is today. Now you don't have to type, you don't even need your mouse, you just tell it. You just tell it. But they didn't do any of that because they were really successful. Copier company. The next one of the others, this is not exhaustive, but this is a long list because you need to see it. They were pioneers. Natural language user interfaces. Okay? Siri, Cortana. You're driving down the road and you say, call home, and your car calls home. You have to understand. That seems simple to you, but what if you have a Georgian accent? Is your car going to understand your Southern drawl, your Boston accent? Oh yeah, this is all. They created all this. It was brilliant, but they didn't do anything with it. Why? They were such a successful, pioneering copy country. The next big thing they did was the Rotary Dial. Before you had the Rotary Dial, you had to click on the thing to send sparks to an operator who knew you were trying to do something. You say, connect me to somebody. Well, they fixed it so you can go like this, and you don't have to click and find an operator. You can call somebody direct, a Rotary Dial. But they didn't do anything for their copy company, so they didn't do anything with it. Because they were so successful. They created the iPod click wheel. It took a little bit after the Rotary Dial because the iPod gives you all the music you want in your pocket. And the click wheel sharply defined functionality of the tactile simplicity in a way it reinvigorated an interest in music. Marty Getz was at this conference as we were transitioning between the old movement and the new thing that God is doing with us. He said, we used to know how successful we were by how many CDs we sold. And he looked because his daughter Misha was standing next to Josh, and he said, what's a CD? Well, he used to know. You understand? Not anymore. But they didn't do any of that. Why? They were successful, a incredibly successful copier company. The QWERTY keyboard. The QWERTY keyboard. QWERTY. And that's why when you have a keyboard, the letters aren't in order. They are scattered around because if you hit two keys next to one another, you jammed it up. Because they had to have time to go from this letter to this letter. And so he stirred it up in a way that you no longer have A, B, C. The A is here. You can do that. Now you can go as fast as you can go, as fast as your fingers will take you. And by the way, it's set up in such a way that if you use the top line, you can spell typewriter. If you go down the top line, it spells typewriter. And young people say, what's a typewriter? But they didn't do anything with it. Why? Because it really didn't affect the copy industry. And they were an incredibly successful copy company. Predictive text. This came into our phones because in the phones it was harder to type because it was a smaller keyboard. And so they developed a T9, the letter T, the number 9. We spend less time trying to fumble because the phone guesses what word you're trying to say. It spells it out for you. That's a big deal. Doesn't do much for your copier, so they didn't do anything with it. All right? They were really successful. Electronic tolling collection, the ETC. Prior to the electronic tolling collection, if you were on a road with a toll booth, everybody had to stop, get some money, get some change, and pull through. Now, you just breeze through, and it reads, and it takes it out of your account. And, you know, that kind of transponders, all that stuff, they did that. But what's it do for your copier? Nothing. They ain't doing it with it. The search engine. Sir Dim Barton Lee. These guys are all historic. They were part of that. Use the index of the World Wide Web, WWW, by hand. And so what they did was they developed a key word that you could put in the word, and it'll link you to all kinds of things that tie to that. All right? That's the search engine. But again, doesn't do anything for your copier. So they didn't do anything with it. We're not going to, I'll skip that one. I'll skip that one. Remote control. Remote control was the idea is you can actually control something without being there, which is why today they're practicing driverless cars. It started with Xerox. But nothing was done because they weren't, the handles that have grips on them, it's called a lamb handle. You know how you have, if your fingers fit the handle on your skillet, on your pans, on your knives and stuff. It's a lamb because Thomas Lamb created that. The Solari board. In the 1950s, if you were traveling on a train, they had to get up and change the letters to say what's on time, what's not going to be on time. Solari system allowed them to go far beyond that, where they could just push a button and all of a sudden the sign changes. And to make people comfortable, it goes click, 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 which wasn't necessary, but they knew they didn't want people to know it wasn't changing. And they designed that, but they didn't do it because they were so successful. An internet chat relay, the web browser, a popsicle stick, which allowed you to eat ice cream with your fingers without being so messy. You know, the minute hand. Clocks only had an hour hand because that was close enough. However, a minute hand allows us to break that down. And they created that. They were so successful. E-readers. Bookstores are gone. Our 2 generations from me, why would you have a book? You go into my living room, I have this huge library of books, and people walk in, I got that on my phone. The hashtag. They invade caller ID. Now you know who's calling you, so you don't have to answer. Satellite navigation system, GPS. They developed that. Didn't really do anything for a computer or for a copier, so they didn't do anything with it. Okay, now I think I'm going to see if there's anything else that interests you. Virtual reality. They did all that stuff. It was in the research and development. They did absolutely nothing with it. A young guy who was trying to do something computer named Steve Jobs visited their R&D factory. He'd been working on computers for almost 3 years, and he walked in there and looked at that and say, wow, we don't know what we're doing. And so what people don't know about Steve Jobs is that he went back to his team and said, we got to throw out everything we did and tie into Xerox R&D. He went over there, hired their top engineers, and brought them to his company and created the Apple computer, right? Why doesn't anyone know Xerox today? They went bankrupt because they couldn't compete with Koji, who had a better copier. They were pioneers. And they established a very successful commodity with worldwide recognition, and they died because the world no longer needed a pioneering system. This congregation was planted in 1987. When I was 25 years old, it was a stake in the ground where we are going to be Messianic Jewish synagogue. Not just a Messianic synagogue, Beth Messiah, Messianic synagogue. And I drove that into people. We've been here a long time. We are a Messianic synagogue. We are not a church. We are not a synagogue. We are a Messianic synagogue. And we strengthen that. You push back on the church and you go against the Jewish community. And here we are. And the reality is, since that time, a lot of you have come here after 1987. And if we don't stop being a pioneering group, we're going to become obsolete and go bankrupt. Because just because you're successful doesn't mean you can keep going, which is why we had the last MLR. It was the 15th. It had served its purpose. There's no point in doing it anymore. Because we are no longer a part of a messianic movement. We have become a messianic community. We are established. We are here. We don't have to push back against the church. We have lost tremendous amount by not being honest about the biblical concept. If we have our baggage, they have their baggage, and we are in the kingdom together. We cannot afford to be anti-Christian, no matter how they feel about us. And I've taught that, but now I see it so clearly. We got the partnership with the church. If we don't partnership with the church, we're missing half of or 2/3 of what God's doing in the world today. Yes, they're not doing it all right. That's okay. Judaism isn't doing all the right way. And Messianic Judaism is not doing it all the right way. We also have to embrace the Jewish community. They have a place that they could come and be exposed to the truth. I don't have to prove to them I'm Jewish. You don't have to prove to anybody you're Jewish. We are a Messianic community who are following the precepts of one new man. We come together where we are comfortable with the things of God, and God wants to do what he wants to do, even if it upsets our apple cart. We didn't have any of the liturgy today. Some people would be uncomfortable with that. That throws off what we're supposed to do in the computer and stuff like that. But you know what? I don't need the liturgy to gather together with God's people. I need God's people to gather together with people. And I appreciate you here. That was the introduction. Now I'm going to give a message. We're going to